The transit hub at Verith Station smelled like recycled coolant and something faintly organic that I'd stopped trying to identify around day 2. I'd been sitting on the same bench for 6 hours. The bench was designed for species with narrower hips and 3 more joints than I had, and my lower back had been filing formal complaints since noon. Drift lay across my boots. He'd been across my boots since we sat down. He was a Belgian Malinois, 10 years old, a little gray at the muzzle, and he had decided the floor was acceptable as long as my boots were in it. His chin was on the left one. He wasn't asleep. He was watching the hallway the way he always watched things. Without hurry, without appetite, just watching, the way you watch a door you already know how to open. I was here for a resettlement review. My naval commission had ended 2 years prior. The Galcom Integration Act had reclassified my service record as pending human to coalition, credential transfer, which was their way of saying they'd lost the paperwork and needed 18 months to find it. Handler certification had been reclassified as non-standard auxiliary animal permit, status unverified. That was their way of saying they'd never had a Belgian Malinois in their system and didn't know where to put one. I'd filled out 4 forms. I was waiting for a 5th. Drift had been on 6 stations with me in the last 2 years. He'd been on 12 before that. In the years when there was a commission attached to our names, and the paperwork resolved itself before we landed. He understood transit hubs the way he understood everything, as a sequence of things to be observed and assessed, and then, if necessary, addressed. He had not yet found it necessary. He was patient in a way that had nothing to do with passivity. I'd learned early in his career that patience and stillness were not the same as absence. The distinction mattered. The alien behind Counter 7 had been watching us since we arrived. He was Drellin, long, jointed neck, colorless eyes set wide on a narrow head, a uniform that was 2 sizes too formal for a transit hub. He had the look of a bureaucrat who had been given a small amount of authority and had decided that made it large. He came out from behind the counter at 6:30. That animal, he said, requires certification of non-aggression. I looked up from the form. He has it, I said, filed with the intake desk at 0800. Reference number is on the top sheet. The certification is for a working animal. Your commission is pending credential transfer. Designation is therefore also pending. I looked at Drift. Drift had not moved. He was still watching the hallway, with the unhurried attention of something that had already sorted every possible outcome and found them all manageable. So pull the pending record, I said. It's all there. Until the record resolves, the animal must be crated. I'd heard variations of this argument on 4 stations. The crate conversation was always the same. The crate was always too small, crate was always inconvenient, and the animal in question had, every single time, declined to enter it in a way that made further discussion unnecessary. He doesn't crate well, I said. Then he will need to be secured in the non-standard animal holding bay. No. The Drellin's wide eyes moved to Drift. His ears came forward slightly. Not sharply, not the way ears come forward before something happens, with the mild interest of a professional acknowledging that someone had spoken. Your animal is displaying reactive posture, the Drellin said. He's looking at you, I said. He does that. The Drellin retreated to Counter 7. He made a call. 20 minutes later, an envoy arrived. He came from the diplomatic annex on the 3rd level, and he addressed accordingly. The Vetharak were not small. This one was roughly 7 feet at the shoulder joint, his carapace a deep burnished copper, his transit formal robes a deep green that probably meant something rank-specific that I hadn't bothered to learn. His 2 attendants flanked him at a distance that said they were there to witness, not to act. He stopped 2 meters from the bench. He looked at Drift. This, he said, is the animal in question. Yes, I said, it is very small. Drift's tail moved once, slowly. He was still lying across my boots. He's 10, I said. He has opinions about when to stand up. The envoy looked at me the way diplomats look at civilians who have said something they consider quaint. Then he looked back at Drift. Then he reached out and lifted my transit documents from my hand. Not asked, not gestured toward, just reached and took. Your provisional status, he said, reviewing them, gives you no standing to contest an auxiliary designation review. The animal will be processed through the holding bay and released to you upon credential resolution. which is estimated at. I'd put those back, I said. He looked at me. Those are my documents, I said. Put them back on the bench. He did not put them back. He held them, and he looked at me for a long moment, and then he looked at Drift. And I think that was when something in the room changed, though I wouldn't have been able to say exactly what. The envoy had been looking at Drift the way you look at furniture. Then he looked at him differently. Drift had raised his head. He wasn't snarling. He wasn't stiff. He wasn't doing any of the things that would register as a warning in any threat assessment system this station had on file, because those systems were written by species that communicated aggression loudly, with their bodies, in advance. Communicated nothing in advance. He had simply raised his head and was looking at the envoy with his soft brown eyes, his ears relaxed, his jaw loose, his whole body still. It was the same way he'd looked at the door of every room that had ever needed to be cleared. I said it quietly. He doesn't bite. I paused. That's not a reassurance, that's just accurate. What he does doesn't have a name in your system. The envoy placed my documents on the bench. I am not going to describe what happened next in any detail, because it was brief and cold and off-page in the way that all the things Drift had ever done in a professional capacity were off-page. What I can tell you is that the two attendants left first, which they did quickly. What I can tell you is that the diplomatic annex, one floor up, contacted. What I can tell you is that the Drellin behind Counter 7 had, at some point between the envoy placing my documents on the bench and the hallway going quiet, developed a reason to be somewhere else. What I can tell you is that Drift, when it was done, came back to my boots. He lay down. His tail moved once. He closed his eyes. The hub director came down personally at the end of the next hour. She was a small, efficient Silahari, four-armed, moving the way Silahari moved, quick and economical. And she had my full credential file in hand. Not the pending file, the full file. Handler Calloway, she said. Yes, your credentials have been resolved. I apologize for the processing delay. 6 hours, I said. 6 hours. She agreed. She placed the file on the bench beside me. She looked at Drift for a moment, at his gray muzzle, at his closed eyes, the easy rise and fall of his breathing. Is he well? I said. He works hard. He sleeps when it's done. She nodded once, carefully. She left. I filled out the fifth form. It took about 20 minutes. The hub was quieter than it had been when we arrived. One of the transit monitors on the far wall was looping a notification about a temporary service disruption in the diplomatic annex. No timeline given. Drift slept through the loop. He slept through the cleaning crew that came through the far end of the hall. He slept through the announcement about delayed departures on decks 4 through 7. When I finished the form, I folded it and held it on my knee and looked at him for a while. He had 14 service commendations. 3 of them were classified. I'd carried the summary document for so long that it had a permanent crease across the middle. Every stations we'd passed through in the last 2 years had looked at it and looked at him, and had needed a translation, because the things he'd done were written in a language built for other animals, and he wasn't other animals. He was an Earth animal. 10 years old, gray at the muzzle, lying on transit hub floor tiles with his chin on my left boot. The galaxy had a lot of words for what lived on it. It hadn't had a word for him yet. It was getting there. I put my hand on his side. He breathed. Good boy, I said. He didn't open his eyes. He didn't have to.